was wrong. Rewrote the song. Thoughts become action. Tell me what's happening. Wish your mind wrapped around.
Divs and spans do is they allow us to actually break up our HTML content without adding any additional formatting. So let's say, for instance, I want to highlight this word. I could add in a span, and a span essentially is an HTML element that isn't going to change how my content is getting output. So I can put them all over the place, and when I go out to the web page, it's actually not going to be any different. I'm going to get rid of my highlighting here because I want to get, I don't want that whole paragraph to be highlighted. I refresh it, and we actually don't know where our spans are located. But the cool thing about spans is that now we can add in attributes into it. So we can add in that class of highlight into this span if we want, or into this span, or maybe into this span. And maybe this one we'll just keep as it is. So we can update, we can select the spans just like we did any other tag. So I want to add in a border around there, and I can also add in, for the class, the highlight of yellow. So let's take a look and see what this looks like now. So we see that all of the spans get the border around it because it's just selecting that styling on that particular class. But the interesting thing here is that we're able to highlight different pieces of content in different ways, and we can really break apart that content. So there is another, essentially a container that we can use to really structure our HTML code. A lot of times you might have seen it used maybe to wrap the entire page. So instead of just using our body, we can do something like div id wrapper or something like that. Close that off, and we could wrap a whole bunch of our content. You might also see it being used for, and you can place these within, so divs within other divs and so on. So I can have another div, and maybe this area here represents my header. So I've got my H1 here and so on, so I've got some head content here, and I'm just going to add in some additional content here, close that one off and save it, make it look nice, beautify. And now let's refresh, and we can see that the divs, they're actually taking up the full width block, but most of all, they're allowing us to break apart and look at our content as if it was in pieces. So just like what we looked at with HTML head and body, the divs allow us to really break apart this content into more meaningful sections of our web page. So I've got one div that wraps this one, and now maybe we want to have another div here, give it an ID of main. So this would be all of our main content here. And we'll just go down to maybe this, all of this stuff is within main, and I want to have another div here and give it an ID of footer. And just to add in some content here, make it look nice again. Go back out to our page, check it out, and we see that basically we've gotten to break apart our content using these divs. Divs automatically start a new line, so if I was to wrap this one in a div, and I'm not going to give this div an ID, so you don't need to specify those attributes. The attributes are not mandatory within divs, and we see that what happens here when this div breaks, it automatically starts a new line there because the div actually takes up that entire block of code. So it's actually, sorry, this one, that's the div. You see that the div, just like the H1s, so they have the same properties as the H1s, same properties as the paragraphs, takes up that whole block of code. So if I was to actually specify, instead of there, if I wanted to do div, so we can see what the div looks like as opposed to span. So quickly, this is still the span. We see that the span only contains that particular section, so it's inline, it doesn't break anything, it doesn't look any different until we apply some styling to it. So take a look at what happens to the divs. When we refresh them, we see that the divs move all the way to the end. They take up the full available line of code. So this div here is taking up that full line. The footer is taking up the full line. We've got the wrapper taking up the full line, the header taking up the full line, and so on. So divs and spans essentially used to build that structure within your web pages and to create some smarter breaking and structure within your content of your web page. So building out your website, building out your structure, look at it as different sections, different pieces, use those divs, use those spans to break those apart and better represent that content. And especially when you're thinking applying styling, make sure you've got those divs nicely laid out and ready to be able to accommodate styling as you add it into the web page. So now one other thing here that we're probably looking at and that we should be considering is that we want it to work as an HTML5 page. So using divs and using spans, especially divs, so this is an older way of thinking. Originally when we were designing our web pages, we didn't have additional options, so we would create divs, we'd give them IDs of footers, but when HTML5 came along, they realized that web developers were commonly doing the same thing. We were giving these IDs for the divs, and they were looking for a more semantic, a more meaningful words for breaking apart your content, and this was all brought in with HTML5. So with HTML5, we got a whole bunch of new tags that we can utilize in order to better structure our web pages. And all of these new semantic ones, a lot of them, they work the same way as divs, but they allow us to have more meaning when you're reading through that HTML code. So I'm going to show you and introduce you to those in the upcoming lesson. We saw in the previous lesson, as we built out our website and as we look at our HTML code, we started to use divs a whole lot. And with HTML5, now we've got some more options and a better naming mechanism within our HTML tags. So let's take a look at what was introduced with HTML5. And it is always a good idea to take into consideration these new elements. We see we've got a whole ton of them here. We've got article, aside, and we've got footer, header, and we've got section here. We've got a bunch of them here that actually represent the same thing that we were doing originally within the divs. So basically, from article, aside, and using any one of these, we can actually restructure our HTML. So instead of having header here, a div as header, we can update this, and I'm going to just call it header. And so this is going to make more sense when you're reading through your web page and you can see, okay, well, this is obviously a header for my website, and sometimes web developers, they might use just the header for the head section. Other times they might have over here, they might have a header. So this might be a header for this particular section, and that's why you still need to keep that ID in there, because you want to make sure that that header, it also represents different sections within your content. So always be aware that whenever you're using these more semantic HTML5 elements, that they're actually reusable, and if you're going to be using them anywhere else within your page, make sure that you keep those IDs if you want to be able to differentiate them. So we saw that earlier, that whenever we're connecting to our styling, we need to be able to pick out those elements and isolate them. So if we want some specific attributes, some specific styling attached to them, make sure that we have a way to identify them. So another one that gets used fairly often is footer. So a lot of times you might see something like you've got header, footer. If we've got a web page, we've got multiple columns here. So we might have something where we've got a section here. So this might be one section. And then another one, so for a side menu, so we might have something called aside. And then this is where our side menu contents would go. So maybe the aside would go there. This would be another section, and I'm gonna have to wrap this one around. So sometimes you're gonna see article gets used. And so now this article has two sections in it, and we've got a side, so side menu. So maybe in here you've got an unordered list and you've got a bunch of list items, so buy now, list item, new product, and so on. So let's go take a look at our web page now and we'll see what it looks like. So we've broken apart lot smarter. This actually doesn't look a whole lot different, but now we've set up the structure and we're ready to apply our styling to make our website look and feel as we're intending it to look and feel. So that's the main thing here with the new semantic elements, to keep in mind that this is a better way for us to represent our code and make it a lot easier when we're thinking about our code, how we want to look, and how we want to apply all of these different blocks of code when we apply some styling, how we want it to look like. So in the next lesson, we're going to take a deeper look at CSS, and we also have forms coming up, so there's quite a lot of information coming up in the upcoming lessons on how to use HTML. So next lesson, we're looking at forms. In this lesson, I want to show you how you can add forms to your web pages. So forms are a really essential part of any website. If you want your users to be able to send you some information, communicate with you, then you need to add in a form. So within this project, I'm going to add in a form right at the bottom within my footer, and I'm going to set up just a really basic form here. And again, it starts out with opening and closing of form tags. So opening, closing, and the content within here is what we're going to be utilizing for the form. So maybe if you want to do something really simple like a newsletter sign up or something like that, so you need to get something like the user's first name. And typically what we usually do for forms is we add in form. So we've got a number of different form options. So input, so the input type, and there's several different input types. As you can see here, brackets is actually giving me a whole bunch of suggestions. So we've got button, checkbox. We've got some new ones with HTML5, so we can do color, date, and so on. So this one is just a really typical text one. So just open, close, and we also need to add in some additional attributes in here. So we've specified one of the attributes that it's a text input field. We also need to specify a name for it. And the reason that we need to specify a name is because we need some way of actually picking up this information and being able to identify this wherever it's being submitted. You can also use ID. So ID is a way to apply styling to it and so on. And if you've got some JavaScript, ID is usually a great way to go to make that connection between the contents of the form. We also have some additional options. So I'll just save that and we'll take a look at our web page now, see what it looks like. And we can see there we've got our form element. So let's actually copy all of this, pop over to CodePen, and place our form in there. And the reason I want to bring it into CodePen is because I want to apply a bunch of different input types here, and I want to be able to show you right away what they look like. So I'm going to do a line break here, and you might also want something like the email. So you want to pick up that user's email address. So we're going to do type, and instead of text, so we could do text, it would look the same, but let's do another one here called email. So give it a name and equal it to email. So again, you don't have to be really that specific with that. I can get rid of those ones because I'm not going to be adding any styling to this. This is just for demonstration purposes. So now we've got one called email, and we see we can type in some text in there. And what is missing on this form? So we type in some text here, but we actually have no button to submit this form. So we need to add that button in. So let's go ahead and create another type. So we've got several ways where we can do input, we can do type, and you saw that we had an option for button. I want to highlight this word. I could add in a span, and a span essentially is an HTML element that isn't going to change how my content is getting output. So I can put them all over the place, and when I go to the web page, it's actually not going to be any different. I'm going to get rid of my highlighting here because I want to get, I don't want that whole paragraph to be highlighted. I refresh it, and we actually don't know where our spans are located. But the cool thing about spans is that now we can add in attributes into it. So we can add in that class of highlight into this span if we want, or into this span, or maybe into this span. And maybe this one we'll just keep as it is. So we can update, we can select the spans just like we did any other tag. So I want to add in a border around there, and I can also add in, for the class, the highlight.
Everybody's wrong. Rewrote the song. Thoughts become action. Tell me what's happening. Wish your mind wrapped in a raptor.
and spans do is they allow us to actually break up our HTML content without adding any additional formatting. So let's say, for instance, yellow. So let's take a look and see what this looks like now. So we see that all of the spans get the border around it because it's just selecting that styling on that particular class. But the interesting thing here is that we're able to highlight different pieces of content